shall be well. We are in the time of COVID. Everybody here, we are pretty convinced, is vaccinated, and yet we wear masks because we want to protect the space between us. Thank you. So, in the news today, some of you already know this, I'm sure, if you checked in with the news source that you used, that on the border between Mexico and Texas this morning, some 10,000 human beings are trapped under a bridge, living in conditions squalid and worsening, and they're part of that crawl north, right? Many of them are from Haiti. That crawl, that inexorable march of people looking for safety, looking for comfort, looking to escape violence, looking for something better, fleeing, trying to get away. And now, they all have a number. I was thinking about that when they announced that, as if that was some glorious conclusion. They all have a number. And I wondered if it was like those delicatessen ones, you know, that you pull off the little slip and you look and you go, oh, yes, I'm 113. And you put it in your pocket and you hope you haven't lost it. How do they give them the number? Is it on a card? Do they tell it to them and then they have to remember it? That's just one story of people moving, searching, and on another border, far, farther away, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, there are close to 100,000 refugees massed on different points along the border, herded into camps, harassed by vigilantes, facing food shortages, exposure, rapes, fleeing a repressive government, and indefinite conscription into the army, hunger. You may not know this, but Eritrea, which is on the Red Sea, is also the site of one of the findings of the oldest humanoid skeletons they've ever found, over 1 million years old. Somebody once becoming us, buried there, our distant ancestors, under sand and rock, skulls of who we once were. And you know, I could go around the world, right? There's the fires in Greece, Afghanistan. In the past decade, global refugees have doubled because so much has happened and so much will happen. The UN predicts that as a result of climate change, that by the year 2050, 1.2 billion people will be displaced by either sea level rise, drought, or flooding, or famine and violence. And right now in our country, some organizations estimate that more than 10 million US citizens live with an undocumented immigrant. And there's a difference, you know, between refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants and migrants. And if you go to the forum at 1 o'clock this afternoon, you will hear, I'm sure, of what those differences are. Will you pray with me? Oh God, these words may be formulated by me coming out of my mouth, but I ask that you bless them, that they be evidence of your Spirit and presence in this your world. Amen. So, who felt the earthquake? I was in the middle of cooking dinner. I live on the second floor of a wooden building, was in my socks, and I mean, well, you know, the feeling where you wonder, is it me? And the floor shimmered, and I tell you, I surfed it, just like the Silver Surfer there. And I was moving around, and I had the presence of mind to turn off the stove, grab my keys, and get into the stairwell. And since then, because I moved here from Sonoma County, and I used to have my bag of important papers and my purse hanging on my doorknob every night before I went to sleep with shoes, right? So during fire months, that's what you got used to doing, especially where I was. You could see the flames and the hills around you, and one time I was less than a mile from the mandatory evacuations, so you think about those things. But I hadn't here. But I'll tell you, Saturday morning, I had the bag of my personal papers and my purse now hanging on the doorknob every time before I go to sleep. I put together a go bag some years ago, moving back to California, because back east you don't think about go bags. So I put together this go bag, and I remember at one point putting out all the things, because you have to go and find lists of what's supposed to be in there, and I would talk to people in the church who had fled fires, right, who'd had 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes or a half hour to gather things, and what it was they missed, what did they need. And I'm looking at this go bag, and you laugh at yourself as you look at the 4 cans of sardines and the first aid kit and the things to charge your phone, and what clothing do you need, and you're going to need a pad and pencil, and you stop and you go, you know, I'm just going to Davis to stay with a friend. Even if I lose everything, I can't put it in my car. So it's not the zombie apocalypse, or is it? So when I thought of putting that go bag together, I thought of back when I was in Massachusetts. And we had a program that we'd put together working with the Lutheran refugees and the Lutheran social services, and we worked with Liberian refugees. And one early February afternoon, I was in an SUV heading to the Hartford airport, and we picked up 2 brothers from Liberia. They were so short, and they kind of clutched each other as they came out of the airplane, both wearing sneakers brand new, but at least 1.5 sizes too big. And they had just flown from the very first time from Liberia to South America to Connecticut, beginning of February. We had warm jackets for them. And they sat in the back of the SUV, and I was asking them questions about the flight and what they like to eat and trying to find things to talk about, and then they started whispering. And the eldest one, the 20-year-old, one was 20 and the other was about 16. The 20-year-old leaned forward and said, excuse me, ma'am, why is everything dead? Nobody had told them about seasons. Nobody had told them how it worked. I'm sitting there in an SUV at the beginning of February trying to explain that they had to trust me, that those dead leaves were going to burst forth into bud at some point in the next few weeks. They did not understand how one part of the world could be so different from the other. Oh, but they would learn. You have not looked at our world, even begun to, until you've taken a Liberian refugee, 2 brothers, into an American grocery store for the very first time. It's the choices that got them. And you don't think about it, and every time I get to the cereal aisle and the fact that there is an entire aisle for cereal, I think about them standing there, looking up, because remember, they were short. They were both a little shorter than me, standing there and looking up at all the boxes. They used to buy bags of rice, and they would ask people in the congregation if they could store them in their attic, so they knew where food was around Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, in case anything happened, because what had happened you see, was when the eldest was about 10 and the youngest was about 6 or 7, is they got roused out of their bed in the middle of the night and told to run into the jungle, and they could hear the guns. They lost their father that night, got separated from their mother, and spent the next 10 years working their way to Massachusetts. They may have been conscripted as soldiers in the Civil War that was raging then. They went through 2 different refugee camps. So many stories about these 2. But one of the things was trying to get them into school. The 20-year-old had to do the GED. The youngest one could be admitted. But remember, the age at which they were taken out of bed, they had not been to school since then. They both read at about the 3rd grade level. And our job was to get them up to speed. And I was trying to figure out how to do that with volunteers. And we had people signed up. And I had the brilliant idea. The brilliant idea that in order to get through reading and history in one fell swoop, we were going to do Johnny Tremaine. Remember Johnny Tremaine, that story, right? We're going to read Johnny Tremaine. We're going to show him the movie. But when we started that, what I discovered is that they had no concept that the world was ever different than it was now. The idea that Boston had had horses and no cars, dirt streets and smaller houses was inconceivable to them. Just think about that when you're dealing with trying to help people understand about time and its passage and what has happened, what is happening, and what could happen. People are us, and they're not us. So when I put together my go bag, I never forget these 2 brothers. And I remember those bones in Eritrea and Deuteronomy 26. My ancestor was a wandering Aramean. You know, they don't know where that phrase actually comes from. It's one of the oldest ones in the Bible. They have all kinds of ways of figuring that out. Where was Aram? Why did the people wander from it? Why does it end up in the Passover liturgy as part of the declaration of who a people are? Begins with, my people were wanderers. My people were never in one place, and none of us in that passage between those bones there and now. Only recently have we had so much stuff that it ends up on boats and stuck in the harbor in Long Beach. Only now do we live in places that are storied on top of each other, on top of each other. We were all once wandering Arameans. And then, in the history of Israel, the times they were sent into exile, the times they stood and looked back at Jerusalem and tried to sing songs as they were being forced away, fleeing, or marched, until Christmas and the story of Joseph and the story of Mary and Joseph and that baby fleeing Herod's wrath, coming back and homeless in the place where he was homeless. You and I are at home. Paul the Apostle speaks of a God who empties God's self of divinity in order to be born helpless and human. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in his letters from prison, God allows himself to be edged out of the world and onto the cross. God is weak and powerless in the world, and that is exactly the only way in which he can be with us and help us. And we celebrate every year the birth of that homeless God, of that weak God. And if you talk about your work in the church or religion in general, and you start floating around with Christianity the word power, and the word power keeps coming out of your mouth, then you don't get it. You don't get it. The turn of the century, there was a philosopher named Schmidt who started using the phrase political theology. The political theology, so people talk about, reflects how your theology, how you understand God, also has an effect on how you understand governance, how you understand power, how you understand where people are in relation to one another. And we sometimes just don't get it. Edith Stein, who was a philosopher, a phenomenologist, a student of a guy named Husserl in the 30s, she has a much longer story, but her doctoral dissertation was called On the Problem of Empathy. And in it, and you may be looking at one of the only people in the world that has a copy of this doctoral dissertation. But in it, it's remarkable. She talks about how empathy should surprise us. It's not like sympathy. It's not something we search for. It's something that comes upon us. It's like falling in love. You know, you can fall in love with somebody for the most seemingly odd and trivial reason, and it pulls you into something you discover. Empathy's like that. Empathy should fall upon you like a shower. It should surprise you, and you can only find it by listening to the stories of others, because it isn't something we seek. It's something, though, that we can nurture by paying attention, by being fully human and seeking connection. And it's a way of being, not an affect. It's what Martin Buber was driving at when he kept telling us about the relationship between humanity and God as I and thou. We must want to know those people on the border who have gotten their numbers. We have to care enough to hear the stories of what it feels like to traverse through a system that we're a part of, whether we know it or want to be or not. And that the one who you formerly thought was other and different is not. That's empathy. So how do we go about quitting the defenses we surround ourselves with? Use your imagination. Think about being in first grade. Picture a night. Picture a mountain in flames. Picture an earthquake that's bigger than a 4.4. A tsunami, gunfire, no time, stocking feet. Where are your keys, and are you on the road wandering with everybody else? Listen, pay attention to the stories. Want to know. And only where he was homeless are you and I at home. Amen.